US President Joe Biden is on his way back to Washington after a 3-day European trip designed to showcase America's support for Ukraine and send Vladimir Putin a decisive message. The president wrapped up his visit to Poland by meeting with leaders from NATO's eastern flank countries, where he stressed the importance of Western unity and resolve coming at a critical moment.
Today, as we approach the one-year anniversary of Russia's further invasion, it's even more important that we continue to stand together. And I think this is proof of this, how strongly we feel.
I don't know. That meeting comes one day after Moscow suspended a landmark nuclear arms control treaty with the US. When asked about it, here's how Mr. Biden responded.
Mr. President, any reaction to Putin saying he's pulling out a new START?
I don't have time.
No time?
No. Big mistake.
Mr. President, how dare you?
While in Moscow, Vladimir Putin issued a rallying cry to a crowd gathered at a concert, calling for Russians to get behind the country's armed forces in Ukraine. Before that, Mr. Putin hosted China's top diplomat, Wang Yi, at the Kremlin, where both sides reaffirmed support for one another.
We want to emphasize here that the comprehensive strategic partnership between China and Russia never targets a third country. Hence, it won't be affected by any interferences or instigation from a third country.
All right, let's bring in Stephen Collinson for all the reaction on from Washington. Stephen, thank you so much for being with us. So Biden addressed the Bucharest Nine. This is the alliance that was formed back in 2015, right after Vladimir Putin annexed Crimea. And a lot of these countries are concerned. They're worried that Putin will take military action against them if he's successful in Ukraine. Just walk us through that.
Right, and of course they are on the front lines of NATO, following NATO expansion after the end of the Cold War. I think what the president did there is what he's been doing for the entirety of this trip, one of the most significant presidential trips of recent times, I think, which is to show that the United States is committed to all of its NATO allies, that any encroachment by Russia anywhere in the alliance would be met by the United States. And this is a trip that's sending a message to Ukrainians, to Eastern Europeans, to the Western allies of the United States that have been bankrolling Ukraine's resistance in the war along with the US, that he's standing firm on the anniversary of the invasion. Having said that, Putin's speech while the president was in Europe showed that while Biden says the US will be there for as long as it takes, Putin is suggesting that that could be a very long time indeed. So that will obviously prolong these questions about whether the West will stay united, and increasingly in the United States, whether there is the political foundation across both parties for US help for Ukraine to linger for many years, especially, for example, if Biden were to lose the 2024 election.
Right, because especially if it also ends up being a Republican president. Who knows what's going to happen on that front. Let's talk about China, because China has made a staunch commitment to Russia here. What is their long-term strategy in terms of the war in Ukraine?
There was a perception for most of the last year that China actually regretted that no-limits friendship that it reached with Putin a few weeks before the invasion, just because of Putin's failures in Ukraine, and it made China look bad by association. But in the last few weeks, we've had some very interesting warnings from US officials, privately to the Chinese and publicly, that China should not think about arming Russia to help its situation in Ukraine. Clearly, China looks at this war through the prism of its own rivalry with the United States and its own interests. And while I think you would assume that it wouldn't want its firms, for example, to face US sanctions if it became more closely involved in the war, there is a case that if the United States and the West are bogged down in a long conflict helping Ukraine in Europe, that their military supplies and readiness is all going to Ukraine. It's not going to their Pacific forces. It could slow down the delivery of weapons, for example, to Taiwan, and the US might take its eye off the ball in the Pacific. So you could see a scenario in which while China may not want to become more closely involved in the war, it does have an interest in this war going on and preoccupying the United States and its allies.
And you've written a comprehensive piece about this on CNN.com that I encourage everybody to read. Stephen Collinson, live for us there. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
All right, in an exclusive interview, Poland's president talked to CNN's Christian Amanpour about the US president's surprise visit to Ukraine, calling it a powerful show of support.
So the very thing that the president traveled to Kiev, that he was there, it sends an incredibly powerful signal, a political and strategic signal. It is a demonstration of strength of the United States, indeed. It is like saying that the American leader, who as a matter of fact is the leader of the free world, is able to travel even where war is raging, even to a place where there is a potential danger. He is not afraid because the United States is strong enough to protect him. That is number one. And number two, he was there, and today he is in Warsaw. He gives his speech to the whole world, and he sends a signal of the defense of the free world, of the defense of NATO, of the defense of every inch of the territory, as the president said today. So to us, to Poles, this American signal, this allied signal, not only within NATO, but first of all, a signal sent by the greatest superpower in the world, a signal sent by our friend and ally today is so significant.
And you can actually watch the full interview with our Christian Amanpour with Poland's president in the next hour. That's at 7 o'clock in the evening, Warsaw time, 6 p.m. if you're watching from London. All right, for weeks now, Russian forces have been trying to capture the eastern city of Bakhmut. And across Ukraine, many worry their town could, of course, be Russia's next target. Some lived under Russian occupation earlier in the war and have now been liberated. They're living on the edge as the front lines move closer and closer and the fighting returns. Here's our Sam Kiley with more.
A year into Russia's invasion, this monochrome misery is all too familiar. This is what happened just 3 days ago here in Monochenivka, an S-300 missile strike. Now that's a missile used by the Russians for ground attack, which is actually designed for bringing down aeroplanes, but it carries a massive warhead. It's pretty inaccurate, and that doesn't matter to the Russians because this is all about smashing up the villages and towns ahead of what the Ukrainians fear is going to be a major Russian push in this part of the country. Captured on the second day of Vladimir Putin's invasion last February, this is no longer a town that scares easily. It was liberated by Ukraine in the fall and is within mortar range of Russian troops today. Yet these teenagers are taking a walk through what remains of their village. Why do your parents not insist that you all leave as a family? My dad has a farm here. He's got land, and we can't just leave it all behind, she says. So we just don't want to go yet. Well, if it gets serious, then we'll leave. And how would you define really serious? In most countries, having a missile that big land in the middle of town is already really serious. Very serious is probably when a lot of houses are destroyed and civilians suffer, she explains. It's the defiance of Ukrainian civilians that Russia is trying to crush. Putin's rockets and artillery have rained down on towns from Kherson to Kramatorsk to Kupiansk and the northern border with Russia, along a front line of 1,300 kilometers. That's 800 miles. This latest assault on Kherson, another example of the indiscriminate shelling of civilians. This isn't accidental, it's deliberate. The areas liberated by Ukraine bear the brunt of an ever-increasing level of attacks by Russia. Here in Kupiansk province, as in Kherson, civilians survive on aid rations. We don't know what to do, she says. Houses are shaking, missiles are flying. We just don't know what to wait for. We're shaking like chickens. We don't know what to expect. Fighting has been most intense in and around Bakhmut, with a surge in attacks by Russia on nearby villages in a foretaste of the anticipated offensive. Veterans like Alex, who captured this tank, called Bunny, from Russia last March, are running low on ammunition. He says that he's sometimes in combat with only 10 shells a day.
It's really hard. We have a lot of casualties every day. And the problem is that the fighting moved inside the city. because we are fighting building to building, and the distance is 25 to 60 meters, so we cannot use artillery well.
Here, civilians place their faith in Ukraine's forces to hold off the Russians and play their part by staying on and staying alive. Sam Kiley, CNN in Monochinivka.